Hi everyone! After finishing the stays and the chemise, it is time for the next big part of this Regency ensemble, namely the dress that goes over it. For this dress we will be using the Laughing Moon pattern number 138, which has quite a few options. The ones that we're going with are short sleeves and some decorations that I will be adding on my own. As usual, I already made the mock-up, so we will start by showing what alterations need to be made to the mock-up, and after that we will just start cutting and working on the dress. So without further ado, let's get crafting. For the mock-up I only made the bodice part because this will all be free-flowing, so the exact size doesn't matter as much. And for now I'm fitting it over the stays only. I left out the chemise because I was lazy like that. Anyway, this is what the bodice looks like with the mock-up. No changes to the original pattern at all. All in all, I am relatively happy with it. It fits well. For the back, I went with the option of an overlap. I must say that the pattern is quite lacking in explanation on how to actually sew the back, but I think I got it correct right now. I'll just have to rewatch the footage to see my back because I don't know what it looks like yet. But the thing I'm not too happy with, and someone already warned me for this, is the boobs. They're quite pointy, again, just like with the stays. So I will change a bit in darts here. And considering it's more on the larger size than on the smaller size, I can just pin the excess mostly here. That's very charming, I know, but that's the way it works. And then you might also have seen the safety pin that I'm wearing here. This pattern comes with a few options for necklines. And the neckline that I currently have on the bodice is the mid neckline. They had an even higher one, but as I was already doubting whether I was going to use the mid neckline or the low neckline, I put a safety pin at the height of the low neckline, and I think I'm going to go for that one, because I think this is rather high, and this is, well, still pretty much higher than the chemise and the stays end. So I can just use that one. So for now it's pinning the darts a bit smaller, transferring that to the pattern, and then we can actually start cutting the fabric. I have never worked with this much fabric before, so cutting was quite interesting. It also didn't help that some of the pieces were bigger than my roll of pattern paper, so I noted on the pieces how much longer they had to be cut, which could then be pinned out on the fabric. After cutting the main fabric, the lining and the interfacing had to be cut as well. I decided to go with a different lining than the one I bought earlier, because I didn't quite like the coarseness of it, and this one fit quite nicely, and I still had this in my stash. Only the bodice is lined, so this takes quite a bit less cutting. After that, the markings were thread traced on the pieces where it was needed. After cutting and thread tracing, we can start cutting the thread tracing apart by just slowly pulling the fabric apart and cutting across the lines. After that, we can pin it to the lining, because we will flatline the bodice part of the dress. And after pinning it to the flat lining, we can quite simply stitch all around the edges to attach the two pieces together. For the rest of the dress, these two pieces will be used as a single piece. Then we can sew in the front darts and attach the sides to the back. After stitching the sides to the back of the bodice, it's time to think about how to finish the seam allowances. This blue synthetic fabric frays just when you look at it, so we really do have to finish it in some way. I'm currently thinking about cutting short the seam allowances and just simply zigzag stitching them. That way is the easiest way of finishing them. The seams can be left open so that prevents bulky seams, and well, we prevent the fraying. So I think that's what we're going to do, cutting short all the seam allowances and then just zigzag stitching them. After finishing the seams, we can attach the side to the front and sew the shoulder seams to complete the bodice part. This is the moment where I have some decisions to make. Only now did I realize that I actually wanted to make a fashion plate of a green dress, but that's blue now. Anyway, this fashion plate had all these bias strips, all these, well, colored strips over the front, which I quite liked because it gives some extra to an otherwise rather plain dress. However, I did not buy any fabric for that. I realized I have this grey bias tape lying around, and I still have the grey linen that I originally bought for the lining, but for which I decided to use something else. However, I don't think I can make what I want with the stuff I currently have here. I don't have any fabric that matches the tape any better than this. And I don't think making these tapes from the linen will work, because I think the linen is slightly too coarse to make these very narrow strips. So I will have to order some more grey fabric, and that means that currently I cannot continue on this dress, because I do want these strips to end up under the neck binding, which is the next step in making this dress. Now that I'm looking at it, and if I'm going to order extra fabric anyway, I'm thinking maybe I can also do the neck binding in grey. But we'll have to see about that once the fabric arrives. So for now, let's order some more grey fabric. When the fabric arrived, it was time to go back to the cutting table, where I recut the belt, and I also cut some strips on the bias for the decorations and neck binding. After the bias strips were made, it was time to figure out the placing. I knew I wanted around 5 strips, but this is just a trial and error thing, where I occasionally step back to see if it looked okay. As an extra added bonus, it covers up the tiny bit of puckering at the dart ends, making the entire thing look just that bit cleaner. After a bit more fiddling around, this is what I came up with, and I quite like it. If I combine this with the neck binding in grey and the belt in grey, I think that makes for a nice combination. Eventually, when I've got the sleeves on, I also might make the sleeve bands in grey, but we'll see about that once the sleeves are on. But for now, let's attach all of these strips by hand. Then it is time for the neck binding. It is simply attached right sides together and flipped over afterwards. Currently I am having a little dilemma when finishing off the inside of the neck binding. After cutting it short, I did zigzag stitch the edge because, well, this satin is fraying. Anyway, the instructions tell me to finish the edge of the neck binding and then fold it over and hand stitch it in place. And you do see a raw edge at the end. Or I can fold it over again, then hand stitch it to the inside, just like we did with the binding for the stays. However, it does mean that the neck binding will end up shorter. Instead of this width, it will end up more like this, which is a rather tiny neck binding, especially compared with all the stripes of the bodice. So do I go for neatness on the inside, but a smaller neck binding, or do I go for less neatness on the inside, but a nice and wider neck binding? Actually, in the way that I'm saying this, I think I am going for the just fold it over. Because, well, the outside is what counts, so then we do want the wider neck binding. Yeah. So, next up, I'm going to finish off this edge so we can hand stitch it in place. And that's it for the basic structure of the bodice. Next up are the sleeves. For the sleeves, we start by inserting 2 rows of gathering stitches on the top and 2 rows on the bottom. Then we can close up the sleeve by aligning the markings and stitching it close. We can do the same thing for the sleeve band. I have decided to add piping to the bands of the sleeves. So for that I will have to make my own piping, which we will do with the grey fabric. I had cut way too much for the bias strips over the front, so that's the same, you can use those same strips. So making your own piping is actually quite simple. I can just grab a long piece of string and fold that in here. And with a zipper foot, I can stitch right next to the string, and then I'll have my own piping. With some unintentional good coincidence, the piping turned out to be 1.5 centimeters wide. So I could just line it up with the edge of the fabric, as it has the same seam allowance. It was pinned all around the sleeve band with a bit of overlap at the ends. After that, we can pin the sleeve band and sleeves right side together, pulling on the gathering stitches to make the sleeve fit. Then, the second sleeve band was pinned to the first, which could then be flipped over and attached by hand. Next up, we can insert the sleeve. With this pattern it will be a bit finicky. They even added a complete map to all the symbols for this pattern. Because of the seam finish that I did here, the notches fell away, so I redid the notch markings with some bright colored thread. I'm going to pin this in. We can match, well, the bright green notches first, because that one is easy. Then we have a marking here on the underside of the sleeve that goes on the seam of the bodice, and then the seam of the sleeve goes on that marking. So let's see if we can pin this in. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to pin all of this with the right sides together, but I'm working on the inside of the bodice and then flipping it over. It might look a bit chaotic, but this way it is easier to fit all of, well, the excess fabric on top of each other quite nicely. So first we pin all the markings, and then we can pin the rest of the sleeve. Stitching in the sleeves with all the gathering feels quite weird to me, as I'm so used to modern non-gathered sleeves that any fold just feels wrong to me. But in the end, it did turn out pretty good looking, so I guess I did it right. After that, all that remains for the bodice part is to cut short the seam allowance of the sleeve and to finish it. That's it for the first part of this dress. I'm actually really happy with how it's turned out so far. There were quite a few new things in this part, like the gathering and making my own bias tape, but I think it turned out quite nicely. And I'm also really happy with the color combination of the blue and the grey. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you did, I hope to see you back for the next part.